Today on the show, we're looking at the search for the soul with two different Christian perspectives. Now, the notion of the soul as an immaterial spiritual self distinct from the human body has been around for a long time, but isn't it an idea that can be defended philosophically and even scientifically? And how have Christians historically viewed the soul? And what happens to us after we die? What does it mean for us today? How might it tie in with views of the resurrection in Christianity? Well, there's lots of questions we could get to today. I suspect, though, we'll be dealing a lot with the philosophical questions on today's programme. As two Christians with different perspectives join me. Richard Swinburne is Emeritus Professor of the Philosophy of the Christian Religion at the University of Oxford. He's a renowned Christian philosopher, and in his new book, Are We Bodies or Souls?, makes the case for the immaterial soul as the defining characteristic of what it means to be a particular human person. Luke Janssen has a background in science research and holds a master's in theological studies. In his new book, Soul Searching, The Evolution of Judeo-Christian Thinking on the Soul and the Afterlife, he traces the way the Christian view of the soul has changed over time. And Luke defends a non-reductive physicalist view. He'll explain what that means. The idea that modern science, though, can explain the way that consciousness and personal identity have arisen in humans. But that doesn't necessarily conflict with Christianity, says Luke. So, are we bodies or are we souls? And what do we mean by that anyway? Expect a deep dive on today's programme. It's a great pleasure to be joined by Richard and Luke. We'll come to you first of all, Richard. Welcome back to the show. I don't know if you can remember, but you came on over a decade ago now, believe it or not, to debate the issue of suffering and evil with Bart Ehrman.
Yes.
Do you have any memories of that?
I remember that I did, no more than that.
Well, I don't know whether that supports or your view of personal identity, which we'll come to a bit later. But tell us a little bit about yourself for those who are unfamiliar with you, Richard, because, as I said, you are one of the most probably influential Christian philosophers today. How long has your journey in that particular field been?
Oh, well, I'm old now. I'm 84. But I've always been a Christian, although my reasons for being a Christian have changed very much over the years, or changed at any rate over the years. I studied what's called PPE as an undergraduate at Oxford. That is one of the components of which is philosophy. And I went on to do graduate work in philosophy, taking a degree called the B.Phil. Then it occurred to me that I really didn't, that the paradigm of knowledge in the modern world really is science, and I didn't know much science. So I was fortunate enough to have a couple of research fellowships which didn't have any great requirements as to what I would do in them, and I spent a lot of time on the history of science, trying to understand both in biology and in physics how we got where we got to. And my first 10 years of academic teaching and research was in the philosophy of science, and my first book, Space and Time, was, its title implies what is space and time, but I took a very considerable account of the then state of relativity theory and cosmology. And I then went on to write another book about probability, in the sense of assessing what in science and anywhere else is evidence that makes this theory probable and that theory not probable.
I mean, Bayesian probability has been a big part, I know, of a lot of what you've
and then
done.
Armed with that, I have written on various aspects of the Christian doctrinal system. The coherence of theism was concerned with what it is to be for there to be a God. Existence of God is concerned with arguments for the existence of God. Faith and reason is concerned with how necessary belief is for the practice of the Christian life. And you won't want me to go through all of them.
There have been so many areas that your work has touched upon.
Yes.
I mean, I suppose one question I have is, do you see that there has been something of a renaissance in your lifetime of Christian philosophy, and obviously these arguments that you have pioneered for reasons to believe in God? You say your views of why you are a Christian have changed. Has it been partly that philosophical journey that you've seen increasingly good reasons to be a Christian atheist?
Yes, I think that's right. Who knows what are the initial causes of our religious belief, but something I found myself with, and in the course of time I looked for reasons for and against it, and I developed my views on what is the evidence for any theory in science or elsewhere. And it seemed to me that the view that there is a God, theism, provides the best explanation of the most general features of the universe. There is a universe, that things behave in regular ways, that is, as we now describe it, scientific laws operate, that these are such as to lead to the evolution of humans, and that humans are conscious. And it seemed to me that a God having us as thinking us a good thing has good reason to bring us into being, and therefore to bring about these other phenomena which are the necessary conditions for our existence.
Now, of course, as someone holding those views, you obviously are going against the flow of many secular and atheist thinkers and scientists and so on. And indeed, your new book, Are We Bodies or Souls, in many ways is partly an argument against the current materialist view of who we are. The people like Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris and others who say our consciousness, the things that we think of ourselves, can be ultimately reduced to physical activity in the brain. So is this a book that you felt you needed to write at this time? I know you've been obviously talking about and researching the soul and consciousness for a long time, but perhaps this is a good moment to write this sort of a book.
Yes, I wrote a book about 5 years ago called Mind, Brain, Free Will, half of which was about this topic. The other was about free will. But it was a book that relatively few people other than professional philosophers would choose to read. It starts with a lot of very general philosophical points. And I thought I would like to write another book which didn't start from such very general philosophical points, but dived into the issue rather quickly. But since then I've had a number of new thoughts about the matter, and so I've tried to write a fairly popular book, but also one which will appeal to neuroscientists and indeed other scientists, of course, and the wider educated public as well.
Well, thank you for writing it, and I think it's going to provide a really interesting subject for today's discussion. Our other guest joining us on the line is Luke Janssen, and Luke, you've been on the show in the past. It'd be maybe good to remind us, though, of your own journey, which I think is quite significant in where you find yourself today as regards this subject we're talking about, because you went into science as a sort of fairly, you would describe it, fundamentalist Christian, but you basically had a crisis of faith along the way. Do you want to just spell out that story briefly?
Yes, I did grow up in a very fundamentalist Christian setting, one that took the Bible literally, and that was all fine. That worked fine for the first, say, 2 decades of my life. But at the same time, around the second decade, that's when I started to go down the path of science and get a PhD and start a research lab and publish in a scientific area. But in the course of doing that, I kept finding that my scientific training conflicted with my theological upbringing. The ideas in both worlds were just not gelling very well. And so for, say, the third and fourth decade of my life, there was just a lot of questions. It began with a few questions, and each of those raised a number of questions. And I became so full of questions and confusion over many different things. And eventually I found I had to give up the whole Christian faith. Well, I say I gave up the whole thing. There was a few tenets that I still found I could still hold on to as a scientist, believe it or not. Even the idea of a creator God, when I look down the barrel of a microscope and look at a cell functioning, it's still easy for me to believe in a creator God. But a lot of the other ideas in Christian theology, I was finding I couldn't hold to those anymore. But in the course of doing a lot of thinking, a lot of reading, and taking courses at a divinity school that's on campus, interacting with people, I was able to rebuild a Christian faith that is completely compatible with science. Now, I wrote a book that described that journey. It's a self-published book. And then I was on your radio show a couple of years ago for a different book in which I addressed the whole idea of how genetics and human evolution, we have all kinds of evidence for that, which again conflicts with a certain view of Christian theology, a certain Christian belief. And I presented in that book how we could reconcile the two. This is now another step in that journey. In the course of taking the various courses at that divinity school and writing essays and probing into different questions, many of which were about the soul, about church history, about Christian theology and how it developed. And this latest book is in large part built around many of those essays, plus a lot of other material.
I mean, we're probably not going to have as much time as I'd like to get into that sort of more historical aspect of the evolution of the soul, as you call it. But I mean, if you were to give me a thumbnail sketch of how you think thinking has developed over the years as you present it in this book, what would that look like?
I'll answer that in a second. I just wanted to say I wasn't just talking about the evolution of the soul, but the evolution of our thinking on the soul.
Sure.
And that's your questions. So as I studied where our Christian ideas come from, and really our Judeo-Christian ideas come from, and got a better understanding of how we got our Bible, I may not have literally believed that the Bible was dropped out of heaven fully written with all the chapter and verse divisions included, but in a sense, I did, and I think many of our listeners do. We just attribute the Bible directly as a transcript from God's own mouth, or Him whispering into the ears of people. But I really got a better appreciation of how the Bible it's a collaboration. It's a human and divine collaboration, but it is written by humans. It was collated by humans. It includes a lot of the human experiences in the human search to understand God. And I really got a better understanding of the human element of the Bible. Peter Enns is noted for, at least for me, was very important in bringing to me the idea that the Bible is both human and divine, in the same way that we would say that Christians would believe that Jesus is human and divine. So the Bible is very much a human document, and here's perhaps a bit of a harder thing for some of our listeners to understand. A lot of the ideas in the Bible, we can trace them to other thinking groups. We do see elements of ancient Near Eastern mythology in many parts of the Bible. We do see Greek philosophy. We do see the influence of Zoroastrianism. And more recently, this may not be so much in the Bible, but certainly in Christian theology, we see the effect of science. We now have a whole new understanding of things that we previously believed in the Bible. The ideas that we now hold have been changed by science and these other influences that I just recounted.
Yeah. I mean, this won't be, as I say, the main subject today, Richard, but has your work kind of taken you into looking at the way the soul has been understood at different points in history and through the Bible and so on?
A little, but I'm not very concerned with that, because it seems to me that whether or not Christians were very clear about this during some centuries, unless they hold substance dualism, they cannot make sense of their other beliefs, and in particular their belief about life after death. And that soon dawned on them, because most Christians, I think, Christian thinkers who thought seriously about these matters, for the first Christian millennium, first 1,000 years, were in fact Platonists, and Plato was the great advocate of the soul as what makes us who we are. And I see most, possibly 90-95% of serious theologians were in fact Platonists. Not all the human authors of the Bible got as far as thinking about what it would be like for us to survive death, and what are the necessary conditions for us to survive death, and what are the necessary conditions for us being who we are. They just had the view that here we are, responsible for our lives, and God will take us after death and resurrect us. And very soon the Church came to believe that there would be an intermediate period between our death and resurrection, where we would still be alive, but our bodies would be in the grave. And so, of course, they believed that what made us had to be something else than our bodies. So, I mean, that was at the background of all subsequent Christian thought, even though it certainly wasn't, I accept the point, at the foreground of a lot of people who wrote the human authors of the Bible.
And I'm sure Luke will want to respond to that soon, but it does take us directly into the meat of this issue, which is that you, I guess, see yourself in that line now, Richard, of someone who does defend from a philosophical perspective that idea of an immaterial soul, that Platonic idea, and that you see this as the best explanation of the Christian worldview, if you like, and as regards afterlife, resurrection, and so on. Now, you've mentioned already a specific view you take, substance dualism, and perhaps it would be good at the outset to frame some of these terms. We just did, interestingly, not that long ago, a subject on consciousness, a discussion, and the view under debate then was panpsychism versus a sort of materialist view. And this is yet another sort of variety of different ways in which people think about this. So would you like to sketch out your view and how it's very different, obviously, to the physicalism that I think both Luke are going to represent from a Christian point of view, but that many, obviously, atheist thinkers believe in today?
First, a small addition to what you have just said. It's true, I do regard my view as the best account, indeed necessary, for Christian doctrine. But the grounds I put forward in this book we're talking about of mine, Are We Bodies or Souls, doesn't mention Christianity at all.
It's purely philosophical argument.
I think the arguments for substance dualism are entirely of a scientific and philosophical kind, and substance dualism is a view that can be held by atheists as well as by theists.
Okay.
But of course, theism, or Christian theism, needs it, but it doesn't need to. Christian theists don't need to have Christian theism in order to believe it. That having been said, substance dualism is the view that humans have two parts: body and soul. Body is a physical object. Soul is an immaterial, non-physical object. They interact in the brain. It's the more extreme form of dualism. That is to say, there's a form of dualism which says there are two properties associated with humans, and humans themselves are just bodies, but there are, as well as the bodies have properties of a physical kind, such as weight and mass and size, but they also have conscious events. They have conscious properties of thinking about this or having pains and sensations. And of course, I agree with that. But I go beyond that in saying that these conscious properties are properties of a soul. My sensations are properties of my soul. They are no doubt caused, many of them, by goings on in my brain, and goings on in my soul, my conscious events, including the intentions which I form to move my limbs and live my life. They cause brain events which cause, in turn, the movements of my limbs. That is substance dualism, and that is the view which I defend.
So, and just to be clear on this, so the immaterial aspect of us, our soul, as it were, the things that happen there have physical effects in the brain,
yes,
which
yes.
Then obviously, does it work the other way? Can as it were,
yes.
the brain have effects on our mental aspect, the soul?
Indeed, but I mean, in a more obvious, direct way, if you stick a pin into me, this creates some going on in the brain which makes me feel pain. But yes, in the long term and so on, yes, of course, yeah.
So we'll obviously get into the specifics of why you think this is the best understanding as opposed to a materialist, physicalist understanding. But Luke, this is a good point for you to lay out your view now. Now, many people hearing the idea of that you're a physicalist, that you believe we are actually body, there is no immaterial part to us, a soul, might think, well, you sound very much like an atheist, a materialist, like a Daniel Dennett or someone like that. So, but you're careful to add the disclaimer, non-reductive physicalism to your view, Luke. So do you want to just tell us about that?
Well, the non-reductive just simply refers to the fact that we're not reducing the soul to we're not reducing people to zombies, that there is something more to us than just that. I also want to echo something that Richard said, his view of human ontology, the existence of humans, as he describes it in the book, is something that non-believers and believers can both resonate with, or can understand and can embrace. I would say that the view that I'm going to propose is exactly the same thing. It's a view that I can talk to my colleagues about, and they would say, yeah, I can't agree with you. I do want to lay out my fuller view in a few moments, but one thing I think Richard needs to do is to explain what he means by immaterial. He describes the soul as an immaterial substance, and he needs to describe what he means by that. If by definition immaterial means it's not made of matter, then it can't interact with matter. That's just something we understand about matter and non-matter. And if it doesn't have matter, if it doesn't have matter, then it can't have energy. If we talk about Einstein's equation, all listeners would know E equals mc squared, which basically is just saying something with no mass, which is the m in that equation. If there's no mass, there's no energy. How can this immaterial thing, whatever that would be, that has no matter, has no mass, how does it interact with energy? The listeners may appreciate the analogy of matter and dark matter. It's not the best analogy, because we know that dark matter does interact with matter in a very loose way. We can sense it, we can measure it through gravitational. So maybe that's not the best analogy. A better one that I use is magnets. Magnets interact with the electrons in certain substances, and if those electrons are arranged in a certain way, the magnet can interact with it. So a metal like nickel and iron can interact with a magnet, and you can move things that have metals, that have nickel and iron in them. You can move them using a magnet. But another substance made of aluminum, which is also metal, you can't move that with a magnet. And if something that's made of carbon, you cannot move it with a magnet. So how does this immaterial soul move the human body? And why is it specifically attached to one particular body? That, in theory, the soul that's in me moves my body. If I embrace my wife, why can't I move her arms using just thought energy, because I'm so tightly,
Well, these are a number of questions that I'm sure Richard would like to address. I mean, it would be helpful, though, to also just sketch out your overall view as well, Luke, before we get into Richard answering those questions.
Well, okay, I'd like to give the fuller picture, which might take 5 or 10 minutes, but in just a few sentences, I see the soul as an emergent property of the brain, that the brain is an amazingly sophisticated structure. All the billions of neurons connected in trillions of ways just leads to an amazingly complex structure, and it's the signal processing of this thing which gives rise to the soul. Now, when I just leave it at that, I think a lot of listeners just may not appreciate what I'm saying, and I would like to take 5 or 10 minutes. This may not be the time now.
Well, that's fine. I appreciate that you're cognizant of the time we have in this first part, because we should probably go to a break at this point and say we'll be back in just a short moment.
So soon.
I know, it flies by, doesn't it? Lots of questions there as well that I'm sure Richard will want to respond to. We're looking today at the search for the soul. Two Christian views. Richard Swinburne and Luke Janssen join me. Richard's new book is Are We Bodies or Souls? Luke Janssen's is Soul Searching, the Evolution of the Judeo-Christian Thinking on the Soul and the Afterlife. And we're going to have a really interesting philosophical deep dive as we look at their very different views of what constitutes the soul. We'll be back very shortly. For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter. Well, we're doing another deep dive on Unbelievable today. A topic we approached recently, consciousness, the soul. We had a great discussion between Sharon Dirks and Philip Goff not long ago on the programme. Panpsychism was the view under discussion today. Today, though, we're more looking at the differences between a physicalist account of the idea of our consciousness, our continuing self, a soul, if you want to give it slightly more religious language. Luke Janssen is defending that today. Richard Swinburne, Emeritus Professor of the Philosophy of Christian Religion at University of Oxford, is here to talk about his new book, Are We Bodies or Souls, and defending what technically is sometimes known as substance dualism. I did PPE as well, actually, and remember when we did the foundational stuff on Descartes, Richard. He was, one of the first people to really put down this dualistic way of looking at the immaterial and material. And one of the major problems that my philosophy tutors had with that, and made me sort of explore in my papers, was just how does this one substance, this immaterial substance, interact and engage with the physical substance? It felt like there was a bit of a gap there in this being an adequate explanation. And obviously Luke has the same problem. Why, in what sense can we even speak of and so this apparent immaterial substance interacting with physical substance if we can't really give it a description in the way that we do matter in terms of energy and particles and that kind of thing?
Yes, his first question to me is, what is the soul? Well, on my definition, the soul is a pure mental substance. And what I mean by that is that it has mental properties. The mental properties are ones to which the subject has privileged access. My sensations are mental properties because I can know about them better than anyone else. My beliefs are, my desires are, my intentions are, and my current thoughts are. These are all things that I have a better access to than anyone else. And what makes a soul a pure mental substance is that it has the capacity for having these things. And that's what makes it what it is. It has these capacities. And it interacts, I've suggested, with the brain. And then the question to me was, how does it interact? And one wonders what sort of answer would satisfy anybody who asked this question. If I said it interacts by causing X and X causes a brain event, the questioner would say, well, how does X cause a brain event if it's not a physical thing? And the answer, therefore, is that it's a direct effect. There's nothing between them. The one just affects the other, full stop. There's no how about it. And after all, that's always going to be the case, because if I asked Luke, how does one billiard ball hitting another ball make it go away from it? Well, it just does. You may have a word like a transfer of momentum, but then why is momentum transfer?
So the same problem applies to physical causality as much as mental causality. It just does. Right.
But then he went on to say that nothing can affect the physical unless it involves a transfer of energy in the sense in which physicists understand energy. And I say, well, that's just a piece of dogma. A piece of dogma well justified by the kinds of observations which established it, which were physical studies. All of the laws of relativity, quantum theory, all of them are concerned with how things interact in the physical world. But they don't deal with sensations, let alone the subject or the person who has the sensations, and therefore one must expect very different sorts of laws to operate there. And there's therefore not the slightest reason to suppose that souls can't make a difference to things, even though there's no transfer of energy between the soul and them.
Luke, what do you say to that?
I think Richard has dodged the issue. Essentially, if I may say with due respect, you're proposing a soul of the gaps, just something that just does, but we don't. It doesn't explain anything. We need to have science can explain things, and we can test it. We can set up scenarios where we can test something, and we can manipulate it and come up with answers and improvements. But what you're proposing is just something. So what is this immaterial thing? Is it a plasma? Is it something that's electrical that interacts with our nerves?
No,
or is it just something
generous?
I was careful. I was trying hard not to interrupt you, Richard, but I think there's a lot of problems, and one of which is this mind-body problem that has long dogged the issue of substance dualism. The interaction between the material and the immaterial. There's just no explanation given here whatsoever. And we can't just simply say, well, it does because it does. That's a soul of the gaps kind of thinking. And we know
well, I've given good reason for supposing why it does.
Right. Okay, go ahead, Richard.
The good reasons are, well, to start with, we have sensations, and to talk about a sensation just isn't to talk about public goings-on. It's to talk about something quite separate from them. And if anything is obvious to anyone, it is that...
Well, sorry, Luke, what were you trying to say? You're coming in now?
Those sensations can be fully explained by science, and you can say that the soul is some thing just senses it, but we can explain it by science. We can manipulate. We can give the person drugs
Yes, I know.
Okay, well, let's allow Richard to finish his thought.
But you see, what do you mean by the word explained by? If you mean we can give a causal explanation of how it is that a physical event, a brain event, causes a non-physical event, then you may be right. I think you probably are in this case. There may be some law connecting the brain events with sensations, but the point I was making is that sensations are events of a quite different kind from brain events. If some Martian came and visited the Earth, he would observe us going around and doing things, but we would want to know, well, are these beings conscious? Do they have feelings and thoughts and so on? Will they feel anything if I stick a needle into them? And they might, of course, scream if I do, but is there a sensation intermediate between the brain event and the scream? And mere study of what happens in the brain, every physical event you could know, doesn't entail. It's not a logical consequence of them that we have sensations. These are different events, and anyone can see that unless they're totally dogmatized.
And it sounds like what you're describing there is the hard problem of consciousness.
Richard. Well, that's where I was starting from, but my Luke was denying even that, and I was trying to get him sort of Luke, going.
You're familiar with this, that you cannot equate physical, describing physical events in the brain with the qualitatively different idea of sensations, pain, thinking, whatever it might be. And that seems to be Richard's central point, that you have to have a different type of explanation for that than a merely physical one.
There would need to be different sorts of laws.
Sorry. Yes, I was just going to say, would you like to comment on that, please, Luke?
Okay, well, what I'd like to do then is to propose what I meant by saying that the soul is an emergent property of the brain, and this will take a few minutes, but I need to put it on the table. I'll begin with an example that the listeners should be able to understand quite easily, and that would be facial recognition, which would be, I think, a sensation, a form of a sensation that Richard was talking about. So let's talk about how the brain does facial recognition. We all can understand that the retina would receive the light and send that information up to the brain as an electrical signal. Right away, it's received by a certain brain area that identifies edges and contours and shapes and lengths. It will assess the lighting and do contrast enhancement. That's all done within the brain area, and we can manipulate that. We can test that. Right away, then another brain area will recognize two circles in a line as just simply as a face. You present to the brain two circles in a line, and it will recognize that immediately as a face. But then another brain area will fill in details. It will sense the color of the eyes and the color of the hair, the hairstyle, the smile, and the teeth. All of those are processed and added to the whole emerging picture by other brain areas. Then there's another area, a memory bank, that attaches the name to that collection of facial details. Another memory bank that comes in and attaches history to that. It will remember the last encounter with that person. It may remember that the person owes them $5, for example. And then yet another brain area that comes in and attaches emotional content to this emerging picture. It will say, that's a face I love, or that's a face I'm scared of. And I could go on at great length. There's many different brain areas that all come in and give us the sense of facial recognition. So if we can understand that, now let's apply that to the soul as an emergent property of the brain. And I first want to we have to talk about what does the soul actually do? We don't just, so the soul would be something that gives us various capacities. It determines our sense of personal history and our place in space and time. It makes us self-aware. It gives us a feeling of connections to our loved ones, whether they're dead or alive. It gives us an ability to relate emotionally to other humans and other animals. It gives us a sense of our place in society, not just families, but in society as well. It gives us a conscience, a moral compass, and a sense of good ethics. It gives us the ability to look into the minds of others and understand what they're thinking, empathic feelings. The soul gives us an experience of awe and amazement when we look at a starry night sky or at the Brazilian rainforest. It allows us to be deeply moved by music or art. It gives us the ability to contemplate our place in the universe and the meaning of life itself. And it's the source of our dreams and desires and fears and aspirations. Now, that's a long list of things that the soul does. And here's my point. We can explain all of that neurobiologically. We know that there are areas of our brain that give us our sense of our personal space. Where is my body in space and time? We know that there's brain areas that give us, allows us to recognize people and animals, specific people and animals. Brain centers which place us within individual groups and societies, even large social groups. Brain areas that have all the rules. I'm almost done.
Yep.
Brain areas that give us the rules of a social group, our rules of morality, rules of ethics, rules of the land, the laws of the land. Brain areas which give us emotional content. We can study those. We have memory centers. We know that there are brain centers which have memory and which add historical context. We know that there's brain areas that can assess color and intricacy and beauty. So all of these things are processed by brain areas. And if we can accept the idea, the example I gave of facial recognition being a function that we have, an ability we have that's due to all these brain areas impinging on a common goal of recognizing that face, all those things I said about the soul can also be explained by neurobiological principles.
Okay. Right. Well, we've got a very, wide-ranging physical description of how various aspects that we traditionally attribute to the soul can be shown to be taking place at various points in the brain there, Richard.
Yeah, Luke's last word was explains, and let me go back again. I'm not wishing to deny that various events in the brain cause us to recognize a face, but our recognizing the face is it's suddenly occurring to me, that's John, and that isn't a brain event. Well, it may be caused by all of these brain events, but it's not a brain event, because there might be just a computer which did all these things and reacted in the same way without having any feelings at all. Of course the brain could explain why we are able to recognize face, but recognizing a face is something quite different from that, and therefore if science is to explain these things, and it'll have an awful job, it's got to explain why this combination of brain events produces this recognition, that combination of brain events produces that memory. You have to have innumerable laws connecting the physical and mental, and I'm not wishing to deny that could occur. Of course, sure. But of course I wish to go beyond that and say what they occur to is a thing which is separate from the body. But I was just trying to overcome the first obstacle to substance dualism, which is the people who think there's nothing going on except a brain, and it sounds to me that Luke was one of those. As well as that, we have a conscious life.
I mean, coming back to you then, Luke, obviously you feel that all of what Richard is describing can be explained by physical processes, by reference to the physical process of the brain. But obviously Richard says you can do all of that explanation, but it still doesn't buy you a qualitative experience, that is the thing that the aliens coming to examine the brain processes won't know about. They won't have that experience. They won't know if you're experiencing that pain, sensation, whatever it might be, because that's unique. It's something that is a unique privilege of the individual having the experience. And again, as I say, I think, for me, this reminds me of that hard problem of consciousness, that you can't equate a physical state with a qualitative experience, and therefore this is why Richard obviously feels there's a very strong case for there being an immaterial aspect to who we are. So without, again, I suppose, tracing too much of the same ground, what's your response to that? Why for you can that very different qualitative experience be reduced in that sense to the brain state?
Well, let me begin with an example, that of artificial intelligence and computers talking to people. If we can, those of us who can remember 20 or 30 years ago, talking to computers, we're actually typing through a keyboard to the computers, maybe not 30 years ago, but the level of interacting with computers and having a so-called conversation with a computer 20 years ago was very artificial. It involved very scripted responses to very simple answers. And now when you call a government agency, when you call many companies, you get an electronic voice talking with you, and it's almost as if they can it's almost as if you're talking to a person now. It's obviously, you can tell the difference, but my point is, by simply having a much more complex program talking to us from this computer, we now begin to sense it begins to feel like an artificial intelligence to us. And so I'm getting at this idea of Richard using the word experience. The experience we now have with talking to those computers is becoming more of there's a greater sense of reality to it than it was 20 years ago. Now, it sounds like I'm opposing Richard, and I'm realizing that maybe Richard and I can be on the same ground if we just talk about whether he really means substance dualism or property dualism. Those are two very different things. And I talk about the soul being an emergent property of the brain. If Richard would just soften his view to property dualism, and that would bring in this idea of experiences, then we're on the same page. And by the same in the same way, you
okay. Well, let's throw it back to Richard then. Can you maybe define what the difference is between property and substance dualism?
Substance dualism says that humans consist of two parts, body and soul. Body includes brain, and goings on in the brain are cause goings on in the soul, and conversely. But each of us has a particular soul which makes us who we are. And okay, why do I think this? Well, for the same kind of reason that I think that property dualism is true, viz. There are certain facts about the world that you couldn't possibly describe unless you bring in substance dualism. And my way into it initially is by means of half-brain transplants. We are moving towards a stage where scientists may be able to join up severed nerves, not just peripheral nerves, but spinal nerves and therefore brain nerves. Now, as I'm sure all your readers know, the brain consists of two hemispheres, a left and a right hemisphere, and brainstem. It's the top part of each of the hemispheres which is connected to consciousness, the cerebral cortex. Now, it is now well known that some people have to have a cerebral cortex removed. They have epilepsy, very bad epilepsy, which can't be cured in any other way, and they have to have an anatomical hemispherectomy. Despite that, the people who've had this, they do have very largely the same sort of memories and beliefs and conscious experiences. Their motor capacities are maybe rather different. Anyway, now suppose, and of course this is at the moment only a thought experiment, but who knows, in the future some mad scientist will do it. Get hold of three people, take out the whole brain out of one of these people, put their left hemisphere into take out the whole brain from one of these people, and take out the left cerebral hemisphere from another of these people, and take out the right cerebral hemisphere from a third person, and put the first unfortunate person's left cerebral hemisphere into the brain of the second person, and the unfortunate person's right hemisphere into the brain of the third person. Connect them up, join the nerves, and there's every reason to suppose they would both have memories which would seem to them just as genuine of the experiences of the first person as of the experiences of the person who originally had their body. And they would both claim to be the original person. And on the other hand, there must be a truth about whether someone has survived this brain operation. Certainly anybody who knew this was going to happen to them would want to know, am I going to survive the operation? And how is that to be determined? Well, absolutely nothing about their brains or the memories they have would determine it. It wouldn't be sufficient to determine it, because they would both have brains which were as much due to the first person as each other, and they would both have the same sorts of memories and consciousness, and yet they couldn't both be the original person, because if they were, they would be the same as each other, and but they're not. They go out. And
so there's all it's rather a mind-bending thought experiment. But yeah, supposing that some Frankenstein type doctor did combine different people's hemispheres and things. In theory, if the physicalist view is correct, you're saying that would effectively amount to you the same there being more than one of the same person, and all kinds of strange kind of consequences. If
personal identity consisted in anything physical, and if it consisted in anything mental, in the sense of if it consisted in having certain sorts of memories and thoughts and ways of behavior and so on, then each of these people would be equally well qualified, as it were, to be the original person. But they can't both be the original person.
And so when it comes to the way you see it on substance dualism, given that physical scenario could in principle happen, how would you distinguish who is who in that scenario?
There must be something that makes one of them me, if we're talking that, and the other not me.
Okay.
And since it can't be the physical matter, and it can't be the way I think and feel and remember, because these are both the same in each case.
Right.
If there must be something else, and the something else must therefore be a non-physical bit. And it won't be a thought, it'll be something that has a thought, because what makes a thing the thing it is the stuff out of which it's made.
Right. I mean, this is getting really interesting at this point. But you saw in Richard's book here, Luke, where he talked about these possible experiments, which you never know could become a reality. What's your view? Does that undermine the physicalist account of self-identity?
Not the least. As you say, I have come across this before. I've looked at several of Richard's presentations in the past, and I've read this in the book, this Alexandra experiment. I've seen it many times. It's an entirely contrived and hypothetical scenario. Richard begins this with saying we're on the verge of being able to transplant brains, and that's just not true. I wish we had time to get into more details of where we really are at, but this is an entirely contrived and hypothetical scenario. We're nowhere near being able to do that, and I hope you're not basing your whole argument on that, Richard. But even if I do try to play this game by these rules, if you claim that this hypothetical person who hypothetically has only one half of Alexander's brain, and yet hypothetically claims to be a normal functioning person, and hypothetically believes that they have all the memories and attributes of Alexandra, this is all purely hypothetical. It doesn't constitute proof of a soul. And to really get to an important point, it's entirely plausible that the soul of this hypothetical half-brain person is simply an emergent property of the half-brain that they possess. You're hypothesizing that this half-brained hypothetical person is in all respects a normal functioning human being and functions identically to the original Alexandra. But I suggest that's a huge assumption or assertion to make, and we can easily explain the soul of this new Alex and the new Sandra just by simply saying that the brain that they now have, half of what was Alexandra's, that brain now it develops this emergent property that we call the soul. We don't have to propose that by dividing his brain down the middle and putting him in two separate bodies, now we've created two different people, but one of them has a soul and maybe one doesn't, and one is the true soul. We don't have to do that. We can just say both of them now have half of a brain from Alexandra and maybe half of a brain from somebody else. And that brain or half brain then generates this emergent property that we call a soul and a personality.
But is one of them Alexandra or not? Has Alexandra survived the operation?
Alexandra is a collection of memories and history, has a life history and has her memories. If one or both of these new hypothetical half-brain people have the same memories and the same history as Alexandra,
they have some of
then
them.
you can't say that one is or is not Alexandra. They have this. We are our histories and our memories. That's what defines us.
Somebody would want to know if they were going to undergo these sort of operations. And although I as it were, you would say hypothetical, they're not that hypothetical. We are able to. All I said is on the way in the next many decades. We are learning to join up severed spinal nerves. We ought therefore to be able to join up bits of brain to replace some parts of the brain.
It's too early to be making these arguments.
Okay, well
anyway,
regardless, yes, it's the principle of it that we're thinking of, I suppose.
If somebody has a diseased brain, they may say to the surgeon, I want a better brain. I want various parts of it replaced. It won't necessarily be the whole of a hemisphere, various parts replaced. And in due course, if they can replace one bit, they can replace another bit. And so the surgeon says, yes, we can give you a good brain if we replace these and these bits from this almost dead person. And but then the patient would say, well, will it be me who survives? Because I'm not interested in the operation unless I survive it. The surgeon will not be able to answer that question, and yet it is the all-important question. And the all-important question is whether we are the same person, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And I am not who I am in virtue of my memories, because it would be possible to have a clone of me which has exactly the same memories.
And this is the
so
premise of many a science fiction movie that deals with these philosophical issues. There's one by, I think, Keanu Reeves, Replicas, is where he brings back his family who died in a car crash as these sort of replicas with the same memories and so on. And the whole question is, are they the same people as the people who died in the car crash and so on? But anyway, we're going to continue this in a short moment's time. We're a little over time in part 2 of today's programme, so we'll continue talking about this and perhaps start to tie it into what distinctives this gives both Richard and Luke in terms of their Christian views of the soul and the afterlife and so on as well in a moment. But we're doing a great deep dive philosophically today, the search for the soul. My guests Richard Swinburne and Luke Janssen, and we'll be back very shortly.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
Real interesting discussion today. Both my guests are Christians, but with very different views on the soul. And we've been talking about whether it's a form of substance dualism, which is the view that Richard Swinburne has been defending today. His new book, Are We Bodies or Souls?, defends that view. And I'll make sure there are links from today's show as well, if you want to get hold of it yourself. Luke Janssen, his journey in science especially has taken him to the view that actually Christianity is perfectly compatible with a physicalist view of humans and the emergence of consciousness and the idea of a soul from a purely physical basis. And he's been defending that today. His new book is Soul Searching. So the question I've been wanting to ask out of all of this is kind of brings us back to the I suppose key Christian questions around the afterlife. And I'll start with you, Luke, because if you do believe that we're ultimately just emergent properties of matter, what does that mean for us when our bodies go into the ground and decay and rot away? Do we cease to exist at that point? What's your view on that?
Okay, so let me talk about the resurrection in just a moment. I just wanted to very quickly come back on one quick thing that Richard said in the previous segment. He talked about...
I'm going to ask you to keep it brief, both of you, so we can get on to the next subject.
Okay,
go ahead.
He talked about a person going to a surgeon saying, I want a better brain. And that's my point in coming to a better understanding of what soul really is, whether it's a biological product of the brain, whether it's a product of the biological brain. When we moved away from an old view of the flat Earth idea, which we did originally get from the Bible and ancient Near Eastern thinking, when we moved away from that, we could then sail around the Earth and come up with new resources and new discoveries. When we gave up on the idea of a firmament, that hard thing over the sky that held back the waters above, we could explore space. When we gave up on Job's idea of what the weather is, God kicking over jars of rain and clouds of lightning, then we can make predictions and issue warnings for hurricanes. We can improve agriculture. In this case of substance dualism, if we can move away from a soul of the gaps thinking, we can better understand problems with the brain. We can go to the surgeon, to the doctor, and say, I need a better brain. We treat migraine headaches with aspirin. We treat hypertension with a calcium channel blocker. But a lot of people resist the idea of treating mental illness with drugs because they see the soul, the personality, as something that's spiritual, that's not biological. And so they'll simply try to pray away a mental disease, or they'll command a positive attitude, and they may to resort to more other stranger things. So I just think that moving to a different, a better, more enlightened understanding of the soul will lead to better scenarios, better outcomes for mental disease.
Okay.
But that doesn't. Yeah. So the resurrection, I'll get to that right away. What do we associate ourselves with? Is it our body or is it our memories? When an 80-year-old looks in the photo album, sees a picture of themselves when they were 8 years old, do they say, I still got that body? Or do they say, I'm still that stubborn, overconfident kid who's scared and just trying to be cool and look confident? It's obviously the latter that the person identifies with. If that 80-year-old, as they're approaching death, was given the choice between two technologies, that they could keep their body alive forever but lose all memories, or if they could allow the body to die but have their memories maintained forever, I think they would choose the latter. If they were given two more options, if they said, okay, we'll let you keep your original body, we'll restore it, but we'll give you somebody else's memories, or we'll keep your original memories intact, but we'll give you a whole new donor body, I think people again would choose the memories. So it's the memories in our history that we see as ourselves. So when the brain dies, those memories stop. That history is still there, but the memories at least stop. But if we can re-embody those memories and that history, you now have a resurrection of the person. And people are talking about uploading their brains into computers. Paul talks about being given a new spiritual body. Both of those are examples of us finding a new vessel for the same memories, the same history. So that's my answer to the resurrection.
Yeah.
We're just re-embodied in a different form, but it's the same memories, the same properties.
And in that sense, you would affirm, in that sense, the physicality of that resurrection, and that's quite necessary, in fact, for us to be a human again, is that we are embodied, and that therefore, yes, if we come back with a certain memory and history, it's because those have been physically recreated in us by a God who creates this resurrection act in that way.
Right. It's no different than falling asleep or being put into a medically induced coma. In both cases, well, not so much in sleep, you have less brain activity at certain times of the night, but certainly medically induced coma, you lose all brain function. There is no more brain. There's no more neural processing. But if you can then allow that drug to wash out, you can reestablish those memories, and you have the very same person coming back.
Okay.
It's the same idea.
Yeah. Oh, well, Richard, there's a couple of things to respond to there, but for both this idea that in Luke's view, we're going to have a better time addressing issues such as mental health issues and so on if we just take a physical view of the brain. And secondly, no problem. The resurrection is a physical resurrection, so why shouldn't we expect it to be that our we are constituted physically in terms of our memories rather than in some disembodied soul?
On the first point, sure, drugs and brain surgery may indeed help with some some mental disease, but we all know very well that the therapeutic methods of talking to people about their problems and why they have certain views about life and their past experience makes a very great difference to their mental state. So both the mental input and the physical input are relevant, and I don't wish to deny the relevance of the physical, but I do wish to deny the sole relevance of the physical by a long way. On the resurrection point, I in hoping for my resurrection, I don't want the resurrection of simply of someone who has my memories. I want that person to be me. And you could have a clone of me, and then go out into course of time. Somebody will download my brain onto some other device which will upload it onto some other brain, and there could be innumerable people who have all the same memories as me.
But which one is you? Yes.
Yes, which one is me? I want me to survive, and unless there's a principle of identity which is other than the physical, because as Luke admitted, the physical may be burnt in the crematorium and no more left. And unless there's a principle of identity other than, or having memories, additional to perhaps, but additional to having memories and thoughts and feelings and so on, there would be nothing that makes a future person me as opposed to anything else. Therefore, my account is absolutely vital for the Christian view. That's not, of course, I'm saying there's plenty of other good reasons for holding it, but it's also vital because, in my view, and indeed this is the view of traditional Christianity most of its life, when a person dies, their body lies in the grave, but their soul remains, and their soul is joined again to a body at the general resurrection. There are disputes about whether it has to be in some sense the same body, but the soul is the principle of continuity, and that's always been recognized through any philosophical Christian tradition for back to Augustine.
Well, I mean, bizarrely, I was having almost this very conversation just last weekend with a friend of mine, James, who takes a very different perspective on this to me. But I said his view is that if another person was created with all the same memories and everything else, that would be you. There'd be no difference between you. And I said, but if some scientist in principle could, dematerialize me and cause me to stop existing and then materialize me somewhere else with all the same brain structures and everything and the same memories, I would still have no confidence that is me, that I would somehow have survived this translocation. It may be a brilliant copy of me who thinks they are me, but it won't be me necessarily, and I don't think anyone's going to take that gamble necessarily that they're actually going to survive.
Can I step in here?
Please do, Luke, because I know that you're going to disagree with both of us here.
Well, okay, I don't want to necessarily disagree with you, and maybe we'll come back to that. But I've already made the point that we identify ourselves with our memories and our history. I've already made that point, and so if the fact that you could put the same memories and the same history into two different vessels, two different bodies, even though you may not like it, doesn't change the fact that in theory, in hypothetical scenarios, you could clone a person. Again, that's all hypothetical, and we don't base our beliefs, we don't make conclusions from hypothetical scenarios that we're nowhere near being at that point. But even if we were, the fact that you can implant the same memories and attach the same history to two different pieces of flesh, two different bodies, then that would mean that you have two of you, and you can't say, well, I don't like that, therefore it's not true. That would...
Okay, so you're acknowledging that you could, in principle, then, again, it's hypotheticals, but you could have two of you if both of those bodies were just set up in exactly the same way physically, with all the memories and history and so on.
Absolutely. The person that I was, when again using my scenario about the 80 and the 8-year-old, not that I'm 80 years old, but the person that I was at 8 years old was very different than the person I was at 38.
So in that sense, there's
different.
Multiple versions of ourselves anyway. So why couldn't, in principle, two exist at the same time? But what's your problem with this? Does this just defy common sense as far as you're concerned, Richard, or what?
Well, yes, because if there are two people, whether produced by teletransportation or whether produced by the resurrection of the dead, who have all the same memories and so on, they presumably can do different things, and they can leave the room by different doors, and then they will have different experiences from each other. And the one won't know about the other's experiences, or conversely. So they can't be the same person. You're only a certain person if you have that person's experiences. And they wouldn't have that person's experiences, so they must be different people.
Well, or at least from that point on, they would be different people. Perhaps at the moment of the creation.
But I mean,
I don't know.
The mere capacity to have different experiences will make them different people, and if one of them could be, if only one is me, and there's no way of telling which it is, then maybe that one isn't me. In fact, maybe I haven't risen. Maybe it's my clone that's there, and so on. You've got to have a principle of identity which is other than the physical, because the physical is always duplicatable. At any rate, it doesn't exist between death and resurrection. And other than properties, because properties, be they however complicated the mental properties are, they are duplicatable. It must be a thing which continues and a thing which is not physical because not divisible.
We're going to have to start to draw it to a close, as much as I'm really enjoying listening to this back and forth of these philosophical hypotheticals. Luke, where do you want to finish up here? Obviously, for you, ultimately, a physicalist account is perfectly consistent with the view that God could do things this way, that this is the way that he creates moral agents, human beings who can be in relationship with God. But you feel ultimately that's what science leads us to conclude as well from what we know of the physical.
Absolutely. I think now I'll be to some extent repeating what I just said. We had ideas that we obtained from Christian tradition, which we've been able to refine and improve based on scientific discoveries, which is, as people say, it's the other book, the book of God's works versus the book of God's word. And as we refined our understanding, we were able to improve our life. We were able to solve many problems. And here's another one where I think we had an old way of thinking, this idea that there's an immaterial substance. I don't know how to, that's an oxymoron, an immaterial substance that defines who we are, that goes on. If we can come up with a better understanding of who we are as people, we can treat all kinds of neurological problems, brain diseases, Alzheimer's. We can understand Alzheimer's from a whole different perspective. Why does losing a few neurons, relatively speaking, in our brain rob us of the person who we are? Those who have loved ones who have Alzheimer's disease will say, that's not my grandmother anymore. Grandma's now gone, even though this person is still breathing and functioning in front of them. Well, why has that person gone just because they've lost a few cholinergic neurons? It doesn't make sense, but we can better understand things if we reinterpret some of our beliefs with scientific findings.
Final words from you, Richard, as we close out today's show.
Well, I'm all for taking account of science, and indeed I've used quite a bit of science in what I've been talking about this morning. And I have a feeling that behind Luke is a sort of feeling that all progress has got to be physical progress with the physical sciences, because those are the things that have worked. And because we've had such great success with the physical sciences, therefore everything that happens must be explicable by the physical sciences. But none of the advances of science, whatever in the past 2 millennia, ever have in any way attempted to explain why we have particular thoughts and feelings and what it is to have particular thoughts and feelings, let alone the more substantial question, which I'm concerned with, is what it is to be the same person as a person at a later time. And these questions arise not merely with the resurrection and so on, but as Luke emphasized, we begin to wonder these questions when people lose their memories. But, of course, I'm inclined to think it is the same person, even though they've lost their memories. But it's logically possible it might not be the same person. We don't know, and because we don't know, we need to make sense of why we don't know. And why we don't know is because there's something about us that isn't physical and that we can't grab hold of, and that's why we're ignorant of these basic truths about whether we survive operations or not.
It's been a fascinating discussion. I knew it would be. Thank you both. I appreciate there's lots we didn't get to, lots of further conversation we could have had. But
read the book.
Both of them. Yes, let me give them a mention again before we close out. Are We Bodies or Souls? The latest book from Oxford University Press by Richard Swinburne. And Luke Janssen's is Soul Searching, the Evolution of Judeo-Christian Thinking on the Soul and the Afterlife. I'll make sure there are links from today's show. That's over at premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. But for the moment, Richard and Luke, thank you for being with me on the show today. For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.